Let's start with a very basic question. Who were the first Americans and what do we know about them? Well, there's a lot we don't know, but there are some very interesting theories that we can discuss here. First of all, how did they get here? There's pretty clear evidence that human life began in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Africa. And it was only many, many thousands of years later that it came to the Western Hemisphere, meaning North and South America. Now, what is the most common and probably the most likely explanation for how this happened? We can look at the Bering Sea between Siberia and Alaska, or between Asia and North America today, and we have this body of water here called the Bering Strait. It's roughly 50 miles wide. Now, this water has not always been here, though. In the last great ice age, about 20,000 years ago, this was actually land. Now, how was that possible? Well, because of all the ice, the water levels were lower. The ocean levels were lower. Just as today, we're talking a lot about rising ocean levels, and that is a great cause of concern for us. That's because temperatures are warming. Well, in the Great Ice Age, temperatures were colder, and that meant that a lot of the ice, or a lot of the water froze, and the levels of the oceans were lower, and that exposed land. You know, it's often said that the Earth is covered by 70% water, but another way to look at it is that the Earth is 100% land. It's just that at the moment, 70% of it is covered by water. Well, back 20,000 years ago, it was less than 70%. And this area that you see in the light brown here is known, and the areas around it in Siberia, which is the eastern part of Russia, and Alaska, that whole area is known as Beringia, the same name as Bering, the Bering Strait that exists there today. Now, this is, on the right, is the land bridge in the Ice Age. Now, how did humans migrate from Asia to North America? Well, there are two main theories. One is that they came over the land bridge, and the other is that some of them, at least, came on boats that stayed very close to the shore and traveled along the west coast of North America. Now, there are not that many trees in Siberia, up in here, that would allow them to build boats, but there are some, and there are some other ways to do it. So both ways are possible. By far, the most common theory is that they came across this land bridge. Now, there are various migration routes that challenge this theory. This is the land bridge hypothesis in orange right here. Then the other one I've already mentioned, that's the coastal migration hypothesis. But there are others. The Solutrean hypothesis is that people came from southern Europe, from Spain, across the Atlantic Ocean. Could they have sailed across the ocean? Maybe. But what makes that more possible is that there are fossils found in some places in the eastern United States, such as Virginia and Florida. So that is a possibility. Now, let me just muddy the waters further. Some people suggest that there could have been travel from Australia to South America. Others suggest that Uh, well, we do know this for a fact that the Norsemen, the Vikings, came, long, long before Columbus, from these northern areas here. That would be D on this map. But there's another very interesting possibility, and that is that uh, uh, early sailors came from maybe going back to the time of the Phoenicians, who came from the Middle East. They may have come from Africa across to South America. Um, and notice the width of the Atlantic Ocean is not as great here, so that makes it a little bit more likely. Uh, Basically, we don't know. But there are new discoveries being made all the time, and this is a whole field of study that we could call North American or Native American prehistory. History involves written records. Prehistory is the time before there were written records. So we're in the realm of prehistory when we talk about this. Now, why do they come? Well, if they crossed the land bridge from Asia, uh, they very likely came in search of game. They were hunters, hunters and gatherers. There weren't a lot of things to gather up in that far north climate, so they consumed a tremendous amount of meat, and there were enormous, enormous animals. This shows you the height of a 6-foot man compared to the American mastodon. Um, Here's another one, the woolly mammoth, absolutely enormous. Um, there's the short-faced bear, and there were actually prehistoric horses in North America. You may have learned that the Spanish brought the horse to North America, and that is true. But there was a prehistoric horse that went extinct. So when the Spanish brought the horse, they were bringing more horses, but not horses for the first time. There were enormous animals, a prehistoric version of the bison that we know from the animal that roamed the Great Plains in the 19th century in America. Uh, and here's a giant ground sloth. Again, compare this to the size of a human being. Um, Enormous, enormous animals. Uh, okay, and again, you can compare to the size of a human being. Um, and this maybe is the most fearsome looking, the saber-toothed cat. This was, it could be a fearsome place, but humans had the advantage of larger brains, and they could use those brains to help them hunt. Now, once they arrived in North America, where did they go? Well, there are various migration routes that allowed them over a long period of time to disperse over the entire Western Hemisphere. These are some of the possible routes. Now, when it says pre-contact up here, that means before the two hemispheres came together, most notably before Columbus came to what was called the New World. And you can see that there's a tremendous amount of diversity in Native Americans. In general, those in the eastern, what is now the eastern United States, were much more likely to practice agriculture than those in the West. They were more likely to depend on hunting and gathering. But even more developed, the greatest center of population was in present-day Mexico. The Aztec and the Maya civilizations, and they practiced agriculture on a large scale, and they had by far the largest population in North America or in the Western Hemisphere. Uh, there are other very interesting areas. The civilization of Cahokia, it was in Illinois, but right across the Mississippi River from present-day St. Louis, Missouri. And this was a large civilization with thousands of people. And it was built around mounds, which probably were significant as burial places. And what's amazing is that you can see these mounds today. They're a state park in uh, Illinois, right on the Mississippi River. Uh, for a time, people said, well, there were space aliens who must have come and built these things, because no humans could have done it, not quote unquote primitive humans. Well, they were wrong. The Native Americans who were here could point to enormous accomplishments, and this was only one of them. And you see this alongside of a modern interstate highway. Um, Now, in the Southwest, this was a whole other culture, and there were many cultures in North America. This was the Anasazi culture, and the most interesting remains of this culture can be found in a national park, Mesa Verde National Park, which is in southwestern Colorado. They populated also areas of New Mexico and Arizona. Now, this is a kind of a risky thing to generalize on, because when we talk about the major cultural characteristics of Native Americans before European contact, we have to remember that they were very, very diverse, and this doesn't apply across the board to all of them. But in general, we could say that there was not a sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural. That's a distinction that we have in Christianity, where you have heaven and you have earth, for example. You have the supernatural and the natural. That sharp division is not typical of Native American religions. We also know that they traded over very large territories, using, sometimes paths on land, very often water routes on the major rivers, when the studies, some of the archaeological work that has been done on this shows that this trade took place over sometimes thousands of miles. We also know that they did not have a written language. Certainly in North America they did not, but they depended to a great extent on oral tradition. That is, passing information on, passing stories, passing beliefs on from one generation to the next. And what we in a literate society don't realize often is that oral tradition can be surprisingly accurate, and it can carry on for a very, very long period of time. We also, as I've already said, there was tremendous diversity. We're talking about an entire continent, and two continents really. We can generalize to an extent about gender relations between men and women. And many of these societies, although not all of them, were what were called matrilineal. That means the line of descent is passed on through the woman's line and not through the man's. And they were also, in some cases, matrilocal. Local means place. So when two people would marry, the man would often move to live with the woman's family. And that is not typical, for example, of English society. Many of them were hunting and gathering peoples. I believe you studied that in world history. They didn't practice settled agriculture. They hunted and then gathered whatever they could find. Often men did the hunting and women did the gathering, because women had responsibilities for child care that men typically did not have. But also, as I said, especially in Mexico and especially east of the Mississippi River in North America, there was settled agriculture. So they were farmers as well as hunters and gatherers in many cases. Now, it's a very controversial topic to ask which or how many people lived in these various areas around 1500, roughly. That means right around the time when Columbus first came. The largest population center was Mexico. After that, the Andes, that's the mountain range that goes along the west coast of South America, and that was the Inca civilization. In other parts of South America, there were substantial populations. You can see there 8.6 million is this estimate. These are not precise numbers. In North America, perhaps 3.8 million. Uh, Giving us a total of around 55 million people. Now, I've seen estimates that traditionally they were lower than this, but modern scholarship has suggested that the number was a lot larger than we previously thought. I've seen estimates as high as 100 million people or more, which would put the population of North and South America as a rival to Europe's population at the time. Now, why is this number important? Because we know that not that long after Europeans came, the number fell drastically. And what that tells us was that the coming of Europeans was the largest biological disaster in human history. In some places, more than 90% of Native Americans died. Why did they die? From diseases. The most devastating of them was smallpox. Now you might ask, well, didn't Europeans carry these diseases back to Europe? Well, for a number of reasons, they often did not. One reason was the climate of Europe was not, friendly to tropical diseases. There will be much more in class that we will discuss about these topics. So we're going to stop for now on the question of the first Americans.